All right, William, tell them what we're reading today. We're reading part 2 of Heart and Soul, chapter 2. What chapter are we on? 2? Show them with your fingers. Slavery.
Introducing you to Mr. Squid.
But my grandfather Joseph didn't allow any of his kin to eat black-eyed peas on New Year's Day, even though it's an old African-American tradition. This is from the point of view of young Pap, who is a previous slave or former slave who was freed. The beans bring good luck for the coming year, they say, but Pap, which is what we called him, wouldn't hear of it. When he was a young boy, each New Year's Day, buckets of black-eyed peas were boiled and poured into a horse trough for all the slaves on the plantation to eat like animals. Pap hated it and vowed that none of us in his family would ever allow people to treat us that way. Pap was the only African-born slave in my family. Pap was captured in 1850 when he was only 6 years old and brought to America. Hey, William. Even though it had been illegal to capture and import slaves to America since 1807, it still happened, and often. On New Year's Day of every year, Pap told us this story. When I was a child, I would play with all the other children in my village while the grown folk were working away in the fields. They told us to look out for kidnappers because they were stories of people who went missing, mostly children. Who are left at home during the day. One day, when the grown folk were gone out to the field, several of those people ran into the village carrying the nets and clubs and grabbed me and several other children before we could cry out. They covered our mouths, tied our hands, and ran off with us into the woods. The children were marched for miles and miles, all the way down the coast, where a large ship sat out on the water. For days, Pap and many other captured Africans were kept inside a large fort on the beach before they were brought outside and paddled into a small boat onto the ship. Below the deck, African men, women, and children were packed in like fish, chained together, crammed into spaces so tight that they could not stand up. It was dark, and the air was heavy with the smell of sickness and the cries of women and children. The ship was full. It set off for America. The trip lasted several weeks. Pap was sold to a planter in Maryland as a playmate for his son. When he reached the age of 7, Pap was sent out to work as a field hand. Hey, William, how old are you?
7.
You're 7. Did you hear what happened to Pap when he was 7? Listen. So the trip lasted several weeks. Pap was sold to a planter in Maryland as a playmate for his son. When he reached the age of 7, Pap was sent to work as a field hand. I could tell you about the life of a slave all day long, but even then you couldn't guess the awfulness of it. Slaves are people who are the property of other people and must do whatever they are told. They were bought and sold as one would buy and sell any animal or thing. Slaves had no right to property, to family, to come and go as they please, to read or write or speak their own language or have a last name. No right to even protect themselves. No more rights than that of a horse or a pig. The only right a slave had was to work for his master, and work he did. Every morning the slave driver blew the work horn and rang the bell, and all the slaves woke up, grabbed a hoe, and headed out to the fields. In the summertime, when the sun was up early and down late, the air was hot and heavy and full of mosquitoes. With each strike of the hoe to the ground, the slaves sang to keep time with each other and help ease the hard work. Spirituals were born right there in that field, you know. Singing was the only way to keep from dying inside. Pap said it was the saddest thing in the world to hear slaves sing those songs. But it sounded so beautiful, made him want to cry. Some of those songs held secrets too, codes to pass messages on to other slaves right under the nose of the overseer. Like when a slave started singing Steal Away, folks knew it was time to run away. Or when they started singing Follow the Drinking Gourd, the slaves knew it was time to escape in the direction of the North Star, right at the foot of the Little Dipper. Let her down.
Let's introduce her them to Carmen.
No, they don't need to be introduced to Carmen.
I already did that.
Hey, chill out with that. To ease the trouble of their hard lives, the slaves got together and danced on Saturday evenings. Most other evenings they slipped off into the woods for prayer meetings, praying for the day that freedom would come. Since Pap didn't have any blood family on the plantation, older slaves took him in as their own. Before he went out to the fields, he lived in a big house with a woman he called Aunt Hattie, who worked all day under the watchful eye of the missus, cooking, cleaning, sewing, even nursing the missus' children when they needed milk. She raised all three of the missus' children. There were about 100 or so slaves on the plantation, and they were always hungry and dressed in rags. Most of them went barefoot, because master didn't give them but one pair of shoes per year, and the shoes weren't made to last. In the fields, they were watched over by an overseer, who rode around on a horse, making sure everyone did their work. And honey, that fellow was mean. To keep the slaves in line, he lashed them with a curling bullwhip he kept over his shoulder, tied them to a tree, whipped them right in front of all the other field hands. Folks a mile away could hear the awful whippings. It's no wonder that so many of the slaves wanted to run away. You might wonder, why didn't they fight back? Well, child, believe me when I tell you, they did, every step of the way. But unlike their fellow Africans who captured them, they didn't have any guns to fight back with, so they fought with their fists and died. They fought over the ocean on slave ships and were shot and drowned. They fought in the fields, in homes, in factories, where they worked and were whipped, beaten, and murdered. They fought and lost almost every time. It would be a long while before we figured out that we could not win our freedom with our fists or guns. We would have to find another way. That is the end of chapter 2. And this is what's known as a whipping tree. Here's a picture of that. Where the slave masters or the overseer would take slaves to the whipping tree, and they would have them braced on the whipping tree, and they would lash them with the whip. It's an ugly thing. It is an ugly tree, isn't it? It's so ugly by what was done to it, huh? The next part, chapter 3, is going to be abolition. And so this is going to be talking about a little bit more about slavery and then also what the abolition was. I want you guys to think about in chapter 2, what would that be like in modern day times? Can you find anything in that passage that you can relate to modern day times? For instance, Miss A is relating, they fought and lost almost every time. It would be a long while before we figured out that we could not win our freedom with our fists or guns. We would have to find another way. Miss A kind of relates that to the protests and riots that we currently are seeing. And maybe that isn't necessarily a way of getting change. But another way that you could relate that to modern day times would be looking at politics. I know you guys are in the 4th grade, but if some of you got older brothers and sisters or parents, you might go and ask them about the voting process and what that looks like. So elections and tax dollars might play into that. Another thing that I'm also thinking of, so the slaves on a plantation, I am based out of Kansas City, but there are a lot of facets around Kansas City that are old plantations. So maybe while you're driving around the city or when you're on your way different places, you can look for houses that look like they might have been a plantation. Do you want to say goodbye?
Bye.
Hold on, let me end my video. Can I end my video? He wants to know if you guys think this book is fiction or nonfiction. William, do you think it's fiction or nonfiction?
Do it.
Do you want them to know if it's fiction or nonfiction?
Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, William, all of us know that this book would be nonfiction because it's based on true events. And so we know that this is a real thing that really happened in the past. It's our actual history, so it is a nonfiction text. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for tuning in. Have a beautiful, beautiful weekend. Hopefully I'm able to come back next week and publish chapter 3, the abolition. Thank you and goodbye.